All right, so this last PowerPoint has to do with global ecology and conservation biology. So thinking about how we are trying to help the Earth after destroying it, so to speak. So the idea of conservation biology is to try to maintain diversity at all different levels. So again, diversity is kind of a measure of the different species that we have and how many. And why should we care about this? We have talked previously about how diverse ecosystems are more stable. They can resist threats like disease or invasive species. It helps to have diversity because as humans, many medications and drugs have actually come from plants and other bacterial species that exist. And the more diverse a population is, it can avoid being wiped out if new pathogens emerge. So thinking about biodiversity, it can happen on a number of different levels. We've talked about genetic diversity before, thinking about crossing over, sexual reproduction, all sources of enhanced genetic diversity. This can also be on the species level, species diversity. If you're looking at a certain community or niche, what are the different species that live in that given area? And you can also even go bigger on an ecosystem level, looking at all the biotic and abiotic factors in a certain area. What diversity exists in the terms of overall species and all resources? There are a ton of threats to biodiversity, and the first one is in big and bold because that's the major one, habitat loss. So when we take away homes for specific species, then their populations dwindle or leave. And humans are the single greatest threat to biodiversity because we chop down rainforests and destroy habitats to build homes and things like that. Another major threat includes introduced species, so that's where invasive species come from. Over-harvesting. So we might not totally be removing the habitat of a certain organism, but we might be taking too many organisms from that habitat. So I always think of overfishing, for example. You still have the ocean, but if you remove all of the fish from it, then there's no biodiversity anymore. And then global changes. So this is where that climate change really comes in, where slowly the climate is changing, the atmosphere is changing, and so the conditions that were once super fit for certain organisms might not be anymore. And then the Earth as a whole might not be able to sustain life as it once could. Okay, so things that we do. Landscape conservation. This is just one example of the I-70 corridor in Colorado. They basically, to enhance wildlife and prevent hit and runs with animals and cars, they built a bridge over the highway and covered it with all kinds of landscape. It's called a movement corridor, and it's meant to bridge habitats on both sides of the freeway so that they don't become isolated and prevent the death of organisms. Looking at the Earth as a whole, you can see these are considered biodiversity hotspots. So areas where biodiversity is known to be high. And in terms of terrestrial, you can see that in purple. You can see areas of Latin America have high diversity, Costa Rica, things like that. You can see a lot of the Amazon rainforest and other parts of the country too. You can see, and then in the marine areas have orange or red triangles. And so you can see a lot of coral reef areas are known to be biodiversity hotspots. So we have to establish things like nature reserves to try to preserve a lot of these areas so they don't get diminished over time. So there is, for example, one on the Florida Keys where there is a sanctuary. And previously in the last PowerPoint, I talked a little bit about eutrophic, which meant that when there was nitrogen and phosphorus available, algae could be supported. Well, if there is too much nitrogen from things like agriculture and then it runs off into the water, then the algae have an insane amount of food. So they do something called bloom, which means that all of these algae come out of nowhere and they make this big, big, big cloud because they eat all the nitrogen and then they die. And now we have all of this algae bacteria decomposing. And when it's decomposing, it's actually reducing oxygen in the water. And as a result of all this, if you don't have oxygen in the water, well, then the fish can't breathe. So then they're going to slowly die. So algae to a point is fine. But when you have too much algae and these algal blooms, they actually deplete oxygen in the water. So it ends up being a bad thing. And this is a result of excess nitrogen, often from agriculture. And that's why we have something called a dead zone on the Gulf Coast, for example, because any type of runoff in these algal blooms end up depleting the oxygen to the point where nothing can really live. And that's why it's called a dead zone. We also have instances of things like acid rain. So rain or snow or fog, anything that can fall to the ground that has a pH of less than 5.6 is considered acid rain. And where does it come from? Well, burning of wood and fossil fuels. So one thing that adds carbon dioxide to the air, but also it releases other things like sulfur oxide and nitrogen oxide. And those are acidic chemicals that can then fall back to the earth. And what happens is those chemicals, once they're released into the air, react with water and then can produce sulfuric and nitric acid. And over time, when that falls to the ground, it can change the pH of the soil, of the water, and impact wildlife as a result. So here's an example of what that looks like on the forest. Not only, again, falling and hitting the trees itself, but also then infecting the soil and lowering the pH of soil. Even on things that we make as people. Here you can see that over the course of time, again, it's a long time, but still 60 years, you can see just what natural acid rain did to this statue. Imagine what it's doing to the wildlife. Another thing to think about is something called biological magnification. And what that often means is thinking about the different trophic levels. And there might be, photosynthetic bacteria at the bottom, tiny fish eat those, slightly bigger fish eat those, birds eat those. So whatever toxins might exist in these lower levels, well then like these smelt fish might eat a ton of them. So now they're built up with toxins, and then trout come along and eat those that are filled with toxins and so on. So it actually ends up concentrating the amount of toxins in these organisms. And if you get to the higher trophic levels, then they're getting the highest concentration of those toxins. And we can't break them down, and it doesn't go away. One of the key things with that for humans, for example, is mercury found in fish. So that's one of the reasons why we are limited to eating carnivorous fish. We're not supposed to eat a ton of tuna because those tuna ate fish with mercury, that they ate other things that had mercury. So it's this biological magnification of higher in the food web, toxins become more and more concentrated. In terms of human activities, we as humans have depleted the ozone. You can see, this blue guy on the Earth is the giant hole in the ozone. And why do we need ozone? The ozone layer, or O3, is what the chemical formula for ozone is. It blocks UV radiation, which medical interventions classes, sunscreen also does. But UV radiation is the major source of skin cancer that exists. So sun is a good thing, UV radiation is a bad thing. And the ozone layer acted as a shield in that regard. But chlorine-containing compounds, things that we used to spray into the air all the time, certain aerosols, hairsprays, things like that, they actually collect and pool and can break down that hole. And so then you're basically getting rid of that UV shield, which coincidentally, if you didn't know, if you look really closely at this map, right underneath the hole is Australia. And that's why Australia has the highest rate of skin cancer in the world, because they are situated underneath the ozone hole. And they might not wear sunscreen, but you know. We also have something called the greenhouse effect. We, as humans, have been releasing a lot of gases into the air, carbon dioxide and water vapor and things like that. And so those gases, they're called greenhouse gases. What they do is they actually absorb infrared radiation. They absorb heat. And when they do that, they actually reflect that heat back to the earth. And obviously the sun needs heat to be warm and to do our thing. But when we have this collection of gases that basically reflect additional heat back onto the earth, then it can yield things like global warming and have disastrous effects. And mostly this comes from things like burning fossil fuels over time. Okay, so bringing back that idea of global warming, doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere causes 3 degrees Celsius increase in the temperature of the earth. And that might not seem like a lot, but that is a huge amount to actually shift an entire earth and shift ecosystems. And that's why we're seeing things like melting ice caps, which, yes, we feel bad for the polar bears because we don't have ice caps anymore. But then also thinking about, you know, that ice turning to water is now yielding floods. So as humans, we are trying to stabilize things and reduce deforestation and minimize the use of fossil fuels and so on. But as a result, you can see crazy times, like it was 60 degrees in the middle of winter here just this year. Snow patterns, rainfall patterns are shifting. I wouldn't be surprised if there's going to be snow in April, and so on. Another thing is our population is so big, so it's hard to say whether or not we have passed our carrying capacity, but the earth can only support so many humans, and we are at like 7.5 billion people. So is that too much? Probably. But what is that going to yield over time if we just keep escalating? You can see we've kind of been on an exponential growth curve, but if we circle it back to the growth curves, we're going to hit a maximum capacity. So we're going to have to level off at some point. Who knows what that's going to look like? As I mentioned, we're currently at 7.8 billion. Scientists can only speculate what our carrying capacity is for the Earth, but we'll be there soon. Another phrase to think about is our ecological footprint. It's kind of like all of the stuff that you use as a person, total land, total water, all of the resources that you consume. There's a sustainable amount, and then there's a what people actually use amount. So thinking about, you know, whether you could bike or walk versus drive. Do you really need that amount of water? Do you need that amount of land? Thinking about what we could live on versus what we're actually using. So per person, 1.7, in this case, hectares, which is kind of a unit of measurement of space, is considered sustainable, but in the United States, the average person uses 8. So that's a little too much, don't you think? So the idea long-term is to come up with a way to sustainably meet the limits of the earth and hopefully not destroy it for all of our future generations. And so just coming up with more sustainable, reusable measures is something that we're trying to do. All right, you made it to the end.